You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Peter Nealen. At the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War. This audio clip is narrated by the one and only Luke Daniels. You're going to love this series. I love it so much. And Richard has been a great supporter and sponsor of the show, and we're going to show him some love. Listen to the audiobook excerpt. You're going to love it. And be sure to go to audible.com to purchase it. If you're not an Audible subscriber, you can get a free book just by signing up for a free trial at audibletrial.com/Hank. You get a 30-day free trial. You get the free book. If you decide to cancel your Audible subscription, you get to keep the free book, and it doesn't cost you a single penny. audibletrial.com/Hank, and listen after the show for the clip from Richard Fox. Writers, I have an amazing tool to tell you about. A revolutionary writing tool for planning stories. Campfire Pro is what novelists need to go from the seed of an idea to a detailed plan that's ready to be executed. Complete your character design, create a timeline, and track your world building all in one place with our downloadable desktop app for Mac and PC. Without the annoying subscription model so many apps are using today. Visit campfiretechnology.com for special holiday pricing on Campfire Pro today. Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Do you have a favorite writer whose books are auto-buys for you? Wouldn't you love for readers to have you on their auto-buy list, then recommend your books to their friends and on social media? The good news is there are subtle things you can do, things that are nearly invisible to the reader, that will make your stories unputdownable. The Beyond 10 Days course from Victory Editing can help you get the most from your stories and help you build that relationship with readers through your writing. This course is full of awesome, and best of all, you don't have to fly across the country or put on pants. In this course, we'll focus on avoiding info dumps, dialogue mechanics, show versus tell in dialogue, carrying show versus tell forward to your narrative, deepening your point of view and strengthening your protagonist's voice, overwriting and how to avoid it. 10 hours of video content with text and audio downloads. Shine that diamond. Join me at the Beyond 10 Days course. Go to hankgarner.com and click the banner to sign up today. The Forsaken Mercenary series by Jonathan Yanez, a near-future thriller series, is now available on audible.com. The series that readers have loved is now available in your favorite format, audiobook format. The first book is called Drop Ship in the Forsaken Mercenary series. If they can't control him, they'll try and kill him. Daniel Hunt is the deadliest mercenary in the galaxy if he can just remember. 5 years before, he woke up with nothing more than his name. Now his present is on a violent collision with his past and the future of the galaxy. The Earth is dead. Humanity is taken to the Moon and Mars to have a chance. On what's left of Earth, primal gangs war for dominance. A rebel force will discover a weapon of unimaginable strength. The wealthy in the galaxy will do anything to possess. As Daniel unravels the origin of his past, he'll realize he's not the same weapon he once was. But does redemption exist for someone like him? For fans of Jason Bourne and the Weapon X program, this one's for you. Grab your hand cannon and start listening now. The Forsaken Mercenary series, Book 1 Drop Ship, available on audible.com now from Jonathan Yanez. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have my new friend Peter Nealen on the show with me today. Peter has an amazing series. It's called Maelstrom Rising, among other things that Peter's done, but this is where I really connected with Peter over this series. these are some of my favorite shows to do, where I discover a writer, where I'm looking for stuff for my own personal entertainment, and I fall in love with the work that they do, and then, we get to talk about it. So, and Peter's newest book, which when you're hearing this episode should be dropping just any moment now, and it's book 3 in the Maelstrom Rising series, and we're going to talk all about it today. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thanks for having me on, Hank.
I'm excited to have you, brother. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
That's going back a little bit. I started kind of tinkering around in high school, which was over 20 years ago now. Started out trying to write science fiction. There was stuff that I wanted to read more of that I couldn't necessarily get at the time. So I thought, I'll write some of my own. And like I said, that led to probably a good 15 years of tinkering before I actually finally sat down and wrote something and finished it. Somewhere there's still stacks of 70-plus page unfinished manuscripts of Wing Commander Star Wars ripoffs.
That's one piece of advice that you hear a lot of people give is write the thing that you would love to read, but no one else is doing. What was that thing that you were itching for, that you were looking for, that nobody else was doing?
Well, at the time, I wanted more space battles. And you didn't actually find a lot of it in the stuff you could get at the library. This was back in the 90s. And Tim Zahn was kind of the closest to what I was looking for, though. There were the Wing Commander tie-in novels that William Forstchen and was it Andrew Keith, I think, were working on. Other than that, there wasn't a lot of the kind of what now further along down the line it's World War II with the serial numbers filed off, and it's generally the war in the Pacific just transposed into space, in Wing Commander's case with some giant cats in place of the Japanese.
Right. All right. Oh man, Timothy Zahn, some of those, like the Thrawn trilogy, especially, I think is what a lot of people, heap praise on him. He really did do a lot for bringing that feel to such an accessible franchise.
He did, and I think he still did the best in that universe of anybody.
For sure.
I also, at the time, I kind of got into at least part of another trilogy he wrote completely his own called the Conquerors Trilogy. Because he had a little bit of the same sort of space fighters battling it out set up in there. He was trying something a little different with that. It was very much his own thing. It meant that the middle book I never really got into.
Yeah.
But honestly, I think his best is probably the Icarus Hunt, though.
Oh, that's amazing.
Have you read that one?
I have. Yeah. Amazing stuff. Peter, did you ever have someone in your life, maybe a parent, a teacher, some other adult who recognized this kind of storytelling gene that you had?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, my folks encouraged me. I did a little bit of my first, I guess you could say, public storytelling was telling spook stories around the campfire up at scout camp.
Yeah.
And scaring the daylights out of Boy Scouts, some of whom were probably a little too young for the kind of stuff that I was telling because they didn't sleep the next night. But especially when you tell 12-year-old Boy Scouts that a story about changelings taking the place of their buddy in a camp where the buddy system is very strongly encouraged. Yeah. The fact that that was a military troop, so the leaders were all infantry, a special forces officer and a couple of infantry NCOs, didn't help because they just fed the fire as much as they could. It was great.
So from this kid who had a love of stories and really wanted, to live in a wing commander world and to write those kind of stories and make up universes like that, to a reconnaissance Marine, to walk us through that story a little bit of how you got there. And along that way, did the desire to tell stories go to sleep for a while, or is this something that you said, this is something I'll pursue later or continue to pursue while I do this? Tell us about that journey.
Well, it was, excuse me. In some respects, they kind of went hand in hand. For a long time, when I was younger, I was interested in the military for a very long time. I wanted to be a fighter pilot originally. Didn't think my eyesight was quite good enough. I started to look towards other avenues. Was really looking at the Marine Corps in high school when I was also tinkering with writing this epic space war story. Then ended up going to college instead. Had some ideas of being an aerospace engineer, some ideas of maybe being an officer later on. 9/11 happened. I was trying to finish my degree. I ended up dropping out my senior year of college, and going to boot camp, enlisted in the reserves to finish out my degree in the interests of going and being an officer. After about a year and a half in the reserves, I decided, no, I don't want to try and be an officer with this level of experience. So I went active duty. And it was about that point I was already I had a bit of a taste of the infantry life in boot camp and Marine combat training. And I said, well, if I'm going to do it, I may as well go all the way. And I want to go for the toughest job that we've got. So I was able to wrangle orders to 1st Recon Battalion. And then I kept tinkering with writing while I was in. It's, for one thing, sometimes it's a good way to, you got a notebook and a pen stuffed in your ruck. Sometimes it's a good way to kill time because there's a lot of waiting in between operations in the military. So when you're sitting on a fob in the middle of nowhere and you got a notebook and a pen, you can scribble notes and ideas down.
You served in Iraq and Afghanistan, didn't you?
Yes, mostly Iraq.
That I would imagine having that pen and pad is also a good way to kind of process the things that you're seeing and doing every day. And we all use writing to kind of work through things in our own life. And I can imagine when you're in such an emotionally rich atmosphere, to put it lightly, I would imagine that writing is a good way to deal with that stuff too.
I think mostly that side I worked out we operated in small teams, so you were generally fairly close-knit, so the BS and the squabbling between team members tended to kind of cover that. When I was working on writing, I was somewhere far away from that, because I was still concentrating on the epic science fiction idea at that point. It was only towards the end of my second enlistment that I started thinking in terms of, if I'm going to actually sit down and write something, I've got all this backstory for this science fiction that could potentially, I could write some military fiction, kind of cut my teeth on that in that backstory I had set up. And there'd be some interesting stories there. And that was kind of how the American Praetorian series got started.
So the Praetorians, help me remember my history just a little bit. the elite Roman guards, the Praetorians, would they kind of be what we would consider now maybe the Roman version of the Secret Service?
Kind of. I don't think we'd necessarily have a direct equivalent. They were kind of the cream of the crop, but they weren't down in the dirt with the regular legions. Like, they had the training, to some extent, some of them had the experience, they certainly had the equipment, but they were the Imperial Guard, so they rarely left Rome itself. And they became much more involved towards the end in domestic Roman politics. I initially chose the name because it made a good name for a PMSC, a private military security company. Praetorian Security. The way the series ended with Lex Talionis, where that term Praetorian came to have something much closer to its historical meaning, the sort of historical parallel, that only came along later. And in part because the trajectory of the series changed rather drastically about halfway through.
Gotcha. So for someone who'd had his sights set on science fiction for so long, to switch gears to write something that is very present and not imagining a future as much as telling stories of what's going on now and what's kind of how we see the world now. What was that shift like for you in your storytelling?
It actually wasn't all that difficult necessarily, because I was approaching scenarios that we'd kind of been looking at on our own. Like, where are we going to go next? If Iraq finally settles out, where do we go to fight next? Because Marines aren't necessarily thinking in terms of, aside from when's the next break, but after that break, when are we going to go stomp a mud hole in somebody next? So some of it came from that sort of mental gear that was already running and had been for the better part of 9.5 years. And then just adapting to some of it. I've come to call some of my stuff shooter wish fulfillment. It's like, if we had free reign to take on the bad guys the way we want to, how would we do it? And so some of it came out of long BS sessions in squad bays, or one particular that really definitely shaped the Praetorian series happened probably 5 or 6 years before I started it. But it was a conversation with a team leader sitting on an LZ for 3 hours waiting for a bird on the way out of Iraq at the end of my first deployment there.
That first book in the American Praetorians that you wrote, that was Task Force Desperate, right?
Yes.
When you finished that, well, first off, how long did it take you to write that book?
That one took me about a year.
What did you decide to do with it when you finished it?
Well, I was thinking about where I'd even try to submit it. I've been a Bain books reader for a very, very long time, but it didn't quite seem to be in Bain's wheelhouse. And I was a nobody. It was my first book. And I'd seen more and more of the self-publishing sort of thing coming out, so I actually initially published it through a self-publishing outfit called Outskirts Press. Lessons learned, I would not ever do that again.
Yeah.
I spent $1,300 of my own money for something that I could have done on my own, and have ever since.
Right. When you got the book out there, it started finding an audience. were you surprised when you started getting feedback from readers, that the book was resonating with people and that, it was finding its audience?
A little bit. I didn't really know what to expect. I hoped it was good. I'd run it past specifically a couple of other Marines that I'd worked with, one in particular who had done some intel work in Djibouti, where a good chunk of Task Force Desperate is set. Basically, it's like, hey, brother, could you take a look at this and see if this is remotely plausible? And he said, oh, yeah, that's a nightmare scenario that we considered a lot.
Wow.
So,
the world is a strange place right now, Peter, where there are real and present dangers all over the world. We have men and women, that are fighting the good fight everywhere, and yet we at home don't want to give in to the realization that bad stuff happens all over the place, and we want to sanitize everything. We want to sanitize the news. We want to pretend that things can be handled in pleasant ways, and that we don't have to resort to the kinds of things that happen in your books. And that's just not the reality. And one thing that I appreciate about your books when I picked up is that you paint the world the way it is. What do you think about the kind of the state of things and the and why these kinds of books are important?
Well, I think the overall world situation is a lot more fragile than most people like to think. We grew up in one of the most affluent periods of world history, particularly the post fall of the Berlin Wall, post collapse of the Soviet Union world, which I actually a few weeks ago I posted a video on my blog from Peter Nealen, who has written books on the basically the collapse of the post-war world order, which was built largely around the U.S. as the sole superpower facing off against the Soviet Union, and the way that the whole economic system became intertwined on one side of that conflict, and how that's changing, and nothing's really going to be the same. Now, I think in his public talks, Zion is a bit overly optimistic because he doesn't factor in some of the other stuff that's going on that I've, and many others like me, have gotten to see firsthand, as there are factors that push towards war that have nothing to do with economics. And especially as the economic interdependence starts to erode, which I don't necessarily see as a bad thing. I think that the more interdependence creates a certain fragility, that the more complex a system gets, the more fragile it becomes. It's like I've usually got at least one character at some point in each of my series pointing out the more points of failure you have, the higher the probability of failure becomes. So the more complicated the more complex and intertwined you get, the more points of failure you create. Whereas if you're relying on elements for your widget from 50 different countries, if trade gets cut off with one of them, all of a sudden you can't build your widget anymore. And when that widget becomes food and energy, then you've got a serious problem. So I don't necessarily see the atomization of industry and energy production to be a bad thing. but there are a lot of people with a lot of money and a lot of power on the line. Furthermore, you've got a lot of cultural clash happening right now, particularly in the developed world, where a lot of people have been watching their traditions and their cultures get basically turned into something else. And they're getting tired of it. They want their culture, they want their tradition. Now, this can be for good or bad, for good or ill. But we're starting to see more pushback against this global order that was assumed to be the coming default. I mean, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book back in the 90s, The End of History, where he was postulating that liberal democracy was the final form of government, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there wasn't going to be any real history anymore, as everything was going to become a liberal democracy and live in this sort of completely leveled out, liberal, secular, new world order. Well, we all see how well that worked out.
That's funny.
It's why I can't remember exactly what it was, but he came out with something else equally inane a couple months ago, and it's like anything with Francis Fukuyama's name on it is easily dismissed to me. But yeah, I think we've, especially with that sort of new world post-Cold War era, we got this idea into our heads, and frankly, I think it was pushed by popular culture, it was pushed by schools, that we had advanced to a point where we didn't have to worry about a lot of this stuff anymore. And that's not the case. History has shown repeatedly that that's not the case. Some of the perspective I started to get when I started reading Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War between my first and second deployment. And it was like a sledgehammer between the eyes, because you realize that some speeches given in Greece 2,500 years ago could very easily be given today. Because the names change, the tools change, human nature is immutable and stays the same, which means that the conflicts arising from that human nature are always going to be there. You can do whatever you want to kind of try to mitigate the material causes, but there's always going to be something that breaks that down, whether it's ideology, whether it's bored, affluent revolutionaries, because when you really look at it, a lot of the revolutionaries of the last 300 years have been bored rich people.
That original series that we were talking about, the American Praetorian series, that ran for 5 books, right?
Yes, it did.
And your newest series, Maelstrom Rising, the one that you're writing right now, the first 2 books are out. The third is coming. What's the story of this series? What do we find ourselves in?
Okay. Maelstrom Rising, I've somewhat described as a spiritual successor to American Praetorians. It's largely told in a similar vein. For at least the first 2 books, I went back to first person for the narration, which the entire American Praetorian series is in first person, from the perspective of Jeff Stone. A lot of people liked that. When I went to third person, somewhat limited with Brannigan's Blackhearts, some people liked it, some people didn't quite as much. Some people said they missed the tone of American Praetorians. Well, I wrapped the Praetorian series up because that timeline had deviated enough from the real world that it was going to take a lot to try and kind of bring it back around. So this was basically a fresh start, similar sort of outlook, if somewhat worse. And it was also, okay, I've seen a number of, there are a few Third World War series out right now. James Rousseau and Miranda Watson have one, the Red Storm series. Andrew Watts has the War Planners series. Mark Greaney, and I can't remember his co-author, just came out with Red Metal a few months ago.
Excellent book.
I haven't read it yet. It's on the list somewhere, but the list is very long. What I understood, particularly of Red Metal, is that there are some interesting gymnastics that have to go through to get essentially a modern version of the Russians rolling across the Fulda Gap into Germany.
Yes.
And the way I'd seen a lot of this somehow. I mean, Tom Clancy's End War from however many years ago was Russians against the West. Call of Duty has been a lot of Russians against the West in Western Europe. Well, I started thinking, well, what would the next World War really look like? Especially given I don't really like the term hybrid war because it assumes that there are strictly delineated forms of warfare, which hasn't been the case since ever. But I've believed for a long time that a next world war would, at least half of it would happen in the shadows. It would be with proxies, it would be with irregular forces, because nobody wants to push it quite far enough to where that big red button becomes an option.
Yeah. Well, especially the way the state of warfare is now, I think that's a given.
Yeah. So I started basically looking at, okay, if we're to assume all the brush fires flaring up at once, what would it look like? And hence the Maelstrom. And I try to get a little bit of that into the prologues for the books, which are all news reports of painting an impressionist picture of the breakdown, both foreign and domestic. And then, with the first two, I decided, you know what, instead of very few other people are doing this, let's take a look at it from the middle of the breakdown of the European Union. And taking into consideration that there are some very powerful people within the European Union who are likely to get desperate when that power gets threatened. And so I tossed Matt Bowen and his team into the middle of that. And
Slovakia is a location that doesn't get a lot of love in fiction. Was this as you start kind of going through those scenarios that you just told us about, was this the logical location that kind of seemed to be a good place for conflict to breed?
Kind of. Some of it was honestly inspired from a Harold Coyle book from, I want to say, 2005, called God's Children, which postulated a former Yugoslavia sort of situation with the Slovaks versus the Hungarian minority in the south. Also, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland have been at the forefront of telling Brussels to go take a flying leap when it comes to imposing its will on their culture, their country, their sovereignty. So I figured Poland was already pretty well secured at that point. And I picked Slovakia. Again, it was going to be one of those four countries. And I picked Slovakia because there were some fragilities there that could potentially be exploited, and eventually I built the situation as it was, not necessarily that it has to be Slovakia, but it worked for the story.
Right. One thing that I really love about your writing and your books is that you really get these giant set pieces in your books and make me feel like I'm engaged there and feel the enormity kind of the situation. So you really nail that broad scope and giving us the feeling of importance and just the general bigness of the world and all of the way that things work together. But then you really bring it down to a fine point with the way that you draw characters and the way they interact with each other is just amazing. You really have a way with building characters and giving us a glimpse into the everyday life, not only the heroics and all of that, but the mundane stuff too. Really, just makes you feel like you're one of the team. Is that something that you think about when you're dreaming up characters and designing teams and all of that? How do you start putting these people together?
Some of it is now characters are something that I've had to work really hard at because I've generally done plot and action better than character. I built that kind of over the Praetorian series, and I really leaned into it with Brannigan's Blackouts. But generally, a lot of the characters are some of them are loosely based on guys I've worked with over the years. Some of them, it's just. Some of them are amalgamations of character traits from different people. You work in small teams long enough, and you start to kind of understand how some teams work really well together. Some teams are professional in the way that they work, but they don't get along on a personal level. And you got to build the team. You got to understand that you don't necessarily get in the real world. You don't necessarily get to build the dream team. You get the people that you get, and then you've got to work around each other sometimes, and sometimes that results in dudes who are apparently diametrically opposite personalities, but they become practically blood brothers over the course of training and deployment. Other guys who just butt heads constantly. So sometimes, in a way, it just kind of has to develop organically, even within the story. Because if you try and, I've found if you try to force a certain inter-team conflict, it comes across as forced, and it can take away from the rest of the story, because I've seen too many stories where you've got this intense inter-team conflict that it's like, really, now you're going to be doing this? This is stupid, and both of you need to be hazed or shot.
Right. Well, the writing in first person, do you find that helps your character development and to connect personally with characters? I know you said that you experimented with third person, in the Brannigan series, but coming back to first person, do you feel that helps when building characters?
It can, and it does, and it doesn't. With third person and Brannigan's Blackouts, I can jump from character to character. I can do head hopping. So, like, in one scene, I'm looking through Brannigan's eyes, and another scene, I'm looking through Curtis' eyes. So you get to see more of what's going on inside each character's head. With first person, you're limited. You're limited to just the narrator. So you've got to work a little bit harder to get across the character traits of the other guys, and some of it has to be a certain degree of telling, because the narrator knows these guys better than the reader does. So he'll recollect something about the individual he's referring to in his narration that you don't necessarily get to see, but it explains why he does what he does next, or why he's got to be sat on because, well, he's lazy and doesn't want to actually get up, and because I've got a character in Crimson Star who's lazy. He's a squad leader, and he thinks that means that he puts most of the weight on his squad, whereas the section leader says, no, that's not how it works. And the section leader is constantly having to lean on him.
Right. So the first book in the Maelstrom Rising is Escalation. The second is Holding Action. The new book, which is just coming out, is called Crimson Star. We've alluded to it a couple of times. In Crimson Star, where do we see the team, and what are you setting us up for in this book?
Okay. In Crimson Star, I'm actually going to a different point of view. It's actually a step back in time. It's happening contemporaneously with Escalation, and it's happening stateside. So we're getting to see the chaos stateside leading up to, well, for those who haven't read it, let's just say the event, and then what comes after. I moved away from the Grex Luporum teams, so Hank Foss is a regular infantry section leader. He's a retired gunnery sergeant. He'd been an infantry platoon sergeant, a company gunnery sergeant, and now he's basically acting as a platoon commander. So there's a lot more characters. In the interests of time and space and not getting too bogged down, a lot of the subordinates are names with a little bit of flavor. I had to concentrate a bit more on Hank and his assistant section leader, Cole Spencer, and his squad leaders. But it's a little bit less big, open, conventional warfare. A little bit more irregular war, but it's giving us a picture of what's going on at home while Matt is trying to survive in Slovakia.
Man, I am so excited for that book. I'm grabbing my copy today. I can't wait to see where you're going to take this series. How many books do you think the series is going to run?
At this point, I honestly couldn't tell you for sure.
Do you have a big map of events that you're writing toward, or kind of how are you planning out these big events?
I have a general trend that I'm looking at, and the stories are going to come as the strategic situation evolves as I build the story. It isn't one that I necessarily have an ending picked out for yet. Some of it is going to become more irregular as time goes on, and in some places it'll seem almost post-apocalyptic as the high-tech toys get used up without World War II levels of industrial capability to replace them. So, yeah, I'm kind of discovering myself where all this is going.
So much fun. I can't wait to see the culmination of the story, and I'm a big fan of what's going on. We're going to put links to all of your series, but especially the Maelstrom Rising series in the show notes of this episode. Peter, if people are just discovering you and want to connect with you and dig into all the great stuff that you're doing, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
My website is AmericanPraetorians.com. I'm also on Facebook and MeWe.
Excellent. I'll put links to those where they can connect with you also in the show notes. Peter, I'm a big fan. I love everything that you're doing. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thanks for having me on.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War.
The near future. Humanity's only hope of survival entered the solar system at nearly the speed of light. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come? Then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the Sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, or maybe Jessica in his applied robotics course wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed "Answer Me" over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. "When did I get this app?" he thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra. I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this?" "You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right. Doc." Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen," the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. "Come. Now." Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to his ear, Mark stopped and looked around before deciding how to continue. Spiked ocotillo plants looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. "You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I?" he asked the mysterious caller. "You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire?" the caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. "If you're so close, why can't I see you?" he asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.